Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's event. I'm Shana Chestnut-Brightons, the director of the Asia Policy Program at the University of Texas at Austin, and with the Korea Economic Institute, one of the hosts and sponsors of today's event. The Asia Policy Program is a joint initiative of UT's Clements Center for National Security and the Strauss Center for International Security and Law, and we're very grateful for their support of our work. We focus on issues of security, democracy, and economics across the Indo-Pacific. And we're very grateful in particular today to KEI for its partnership and support of today's event, to our speakers and discussants for the time they've invested in preparing their remarks and their papers for today, and to all of you for joining us. It's really a pleasure. I have known and admired KEI's work for a very long time. And so when we got the opportunity to partner with KEI on today's program, we jumped at the chance to do that and to welcome the panelists here to Austin. We're really excited that you could join us for the event, which focuses on economic security in the Indo-Pacific. During his visit to campus earlier this month, Secretary of State Tony Blinken highlighted, and some UT students asked him some pointed questions about the fundamental role that economic engagement, free trade, and economic policy play in American foreign policy and American security interests in Asia. At the Asia Policy Program, we believe it's essential for our campus community and honestly for the international community to understand the perspectives and the needs of global stakeholders, not just those sitting here in Austin or in Texas. So to further that goal, the first panel this afternoon will spotlight perspectives on economic security from Tokyo and Seoul, while the second will highlight the views from Washington and Beijing. We have an incredibly distinguished and talented group of panelists here to share their expertise with us today. I will leave it to each chair for each panel to introduce them, but just wanted to thank them again for the time that they've taken to come to campus and to prepare their comments today. We're really delighted to have you here. With that, I will turn it over to Troy, Senior Director and Fellow at AEI, to offer additional opening remarks to contextualize today's panels and today's discussion. Welcome to the 40 Acres, and thank you for coming here today. Glad to have you.
Well, Sheena, thank you. We're really delighted to be here. We're grateful for everybody coming out. And I also want to express our thanks, not just to the University of Texas and yourself, to all the people here who helped make today possible and to our panelists. In the last few years, the term economic security has become more prominent. But in some levels, we don't necessarily have a solid definition. We don't really know what we mean when we talk about economic security. At its most basic level, economic security represents an effort by governments to ensure supply chains function, that the domestic economy is resilient, and that national security is considered in economic policy. However, if you do a quick Google search on economic security, you'll find that most of the page results actually don't talk about that. They talk about individual economic security. Much of this comes out of the global financial crisis. But at the G7 this past year in Hiroshima, they tried to take and give some definition or some framework to the concept of economic security, or what they refer to as economic resilience and economic security. This includes 7 areas: building resilient supply chains, building resilient critical infrastructure, responding to non-market policies and practices, addressing economic coercion, countering harmful practices in the digital sphere, cooperating on international standard setting, and preventing leakage of critical and emerging technologies. While the term is still being defined, national security is a component of economic security, has a long history, at least in the United States and in other countries. During the Second World War, the US had in place a number of export restrictions. This made sense given the ongoing war. But as the war ended, many of those were lifted to try and export US goods to war-torn countries in Europe and Asia. However, as relations became strained between the Soviet Union and the United States, concerns began to grow that the United States was in essence rearming one of its peer competitors. So to resolve this, Congress passed the Export Control Act of 1949. It was designed to take and protect the domestic economy, further the foreign policy of the United States, and to exercise the necessary vigilance over exports from the standpoint of significance to national security. Because these controls would be ineffective without international cooperation, the US eventually reached out to its partners in Europe to try and take and put together a group which became the Consultative Group. This resulted in 2 committees, one designed to oversee export controls to the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, the other designed to look over export controls to Communist China. These early export controls were focused on military technology and dual-use items. After the Cold War, these arrangements were converted into new agreements like the Wasser Arrangement and included former communist countries such as the Russian Federation, but communist China never actually joined. Of course, since the end of the Cold War, we've seen globalization spread, and the list of dual-use technologies expand significantly to the point to where core commercial goods such as semiconductors and even algorithms can both significantly boost an economy and provide military advantages. With the passing of the openness generated by the post-Cold War and the return of great power politics, and with it new efforts to use export controls, we are seeing many of the same issues emerge where commercial interests should end and where security interests begin. Needless to say, the US and its allies and partners have different views on this issue. So while the terminology of export controls may be new in terms of economic security, many of the issues are familiar. But there are also new elements, as unlike in the Cold War, globalization has raised more extensive issues regarding global supply chains and economic interdependence. With that, I'm looking forward to updating the panel's discussion of how Korea and Japan view this issue, as well as our second panel, will explore how the United States is addressing these concerns and how the targeted country of the US, China, is viewing this issue and what it is doing in terms of economic security, which it has put much more thought into. And with that, I'd like to turn things over to Clint. Thank you.
Thank you, Troy and Sheena. Can everyone hear me? Okay. My name is Clint Work. I'm Fellow and Director of Academic Affairs at the Korea Economic Institute, or KEI. And first things first, I just want to thank UT Austin, the Clements-Strauss Center's Asia Policy Program, Sheena, and Mara as well, and others for helping us set this up. A lot goes into it, and so it's great to see it, coming off the day of. I will be serving as chair and moderator, aka timekeeping taskmaster for my esteemed panelists and discussant. So I just want to briefly introduce each of our panelists and our discussant, and then lay out the run of show will follow, and then we'll get right into it. Starting at the end of the table is Dr. June Park, who is a political economist working on the geoeconomics of conflict in the digital economy, observing East Asia, the US, Europe, and the Gulf states. She focuses on trade, energy, and tech conflicts among nation states as they navigate their distinct paths into the digital future. And her current work pertains to geoeconomic conflicts in emerging technologies, namely semiconductors, EVs and EV batteries, digital currencies, and AI. She is currently a visiting fellow at the Middle East Council on Global Affairs, and she'll be presenting elements of her paper titled "Is Economic Security National Security? Defining South Korea's Economic Security for Future Industries, the Case of Semiconductors." And next to Dr. Park is Dr. Kazuto Suzuki. He is a professor of science and technology policy at the Graduate School of Public Policy at the University of Tokyo, and director of the Institute of Geoeconomics at International House of Japan. His research focuses on the conjunction of science and technology in international relations, as well as subjects such as space policy, non-proliferation, export controls, and sanctions. And he has a much longer bio, which I won't get into now, but you can find that on our website. And he will be presenting from his paper titled "Japanese Economic Security as De-risking." And directly next to me is our esteemed discussant, former Trade Minister Yeo Han-koo. He's a former South Korean Minister of Trade and a veteran trade negotiator who's been involved in many of South Korea's trade negotiations over the last 2 decades. Prior to becoming Minister for Trade, he served as presidential secretary in the Blue House for the previous administration of President Moon Jae-in around his signature New Southern Policy and New Northern Policy. He also has extensive experience in the Ministry of Trade, Industry, and Energy, where he was appointed to multiple directorships over the last 25 years. Minister Yeo has also worked on climate issues, acting as the World Bank Group's Senior Investment Policy Officer in the Investment Climate Department between 2010 and 2014, and he is currently a Senior Fellow at the Peterson Institute of International Economics in Washington, D.C. So I'm very pleased to be sharing the panel with you all. And just very briefly, I've asked each of our panelists, and I will start with you, June, to give 12 to 15 minutes each on sort of their key arguments and takeaways from their papers. And I will As I said, I'll wave my big yellow pad to keep you in time. And then after each of you have given your remarks, I'll ask Minister Yeo to give feedback for about 15 minutes. After that, we'll give the panelists an opportunity to respond to the discussant's feedback, and then we'll open everything to Q&A with both our in-person audience and also folks who are joining on our Zoom webinar. So if you are online and you have questions come up during the presentation, please type them into the chat box, and we will do our best to get to those during the Q&A. So without further ado, Dr. Park.
Thank you, Clint, and thank you to the partners at UT Austin and Korea Economic Institute for preparing this panel. I think it's a very important time point in everything that is going on around the world, including the war in in the Middle East, and US-China tech war, the continuous war in Ukraine. So everything that we are perceiving in the world, we're witnessing series of changes in the global economy. And I think it's a very important time for us to think about these issues in the spectrum of the change of tides. So I prepared, when I first was asked by Clint to work on economic security for this panel, the first thing that came up to my mind was the question of whether economic security is essentially national security, whether there is no characteristic that defines it in our own time. And this is because within the tradition of IR, many scholars have put economic security within the context of national security. And the way that the current US policies are directing these issues, it's also the case that the public is, and the allies or countries that are not allies around the world are fed this how to say, the policy narrative that these issues regarding semiconductors, EV batteries, everything that has to do with future industries matter to the national security. So essentially, there is no independent lining of economic security per se. But when you look at the other spectrum of the policy receiving, US policy receiving node countries, so say, for instance, my own country, South Korea, there are a series of legislations that are put into place because you need to protect your own industries. So whether it has to do with US policies or not, every country that is part of the supply chain is trying to come up with its own agenda and legislations to protect their future industries. This is how I see it. Economic security is essentially, yes, it has overlapping areas with national security. Of course, there's no denying of that. But in our time, what's very, very visible through country legislations and country responses, although there are differences in degrees. Every jurisdiction is trying to come up with their own agenda and policies in order to protect their own industries because the US has taken on a different direction. So in this paper, it's entitled is Economic Security, National Security, Defining South Korea's Economic Security for Future Industries, the case of semiconductors. What I tried to do in this paper is to unravel what they are, because in the past couple of years, there have been a series of discussions about, there's been change of political leadership for this, first of all, and there have been these efforts to amalgamate or blend trilateral cooperation, so Japan, Korea, US. And from the US perspective, it's really about containing China's progression, halting China's progression at their current level of development, especially in semiconductors. Renewables, EV-related issues, China is far ahead. So let's start with semiconductors, and that's what I tried to do in this paper. South Korea's response to the US industrial policy at the onset of Biden's request, should I say, or South Korea's response to US demands or US needs of creating foundries. Over here in Austin, there's a huge cluster of semiconductor companies here because during the 1980s, there was the Japan-US semiconductor agreement. Japan at the time was an up and coming front runner in DRAMs, but now things have changed because the aftermath of the agreement gave the ball to South Korea, gave the ball to Taiwan, and Taiwan, by far, TSMC is a major player. Samsung and SK Hynix of Korea, they produce mainly memories, DRAMs, NAND flash. The real question is it really possible to cut the lines of the supply chain regarding semiconductors as the US wishes to? Because the supply chain for semiconductors is so diverse and it's complicated, whether export controls alone will achieve this goal. And especially when even US companies need to make their profits through sales to China. So in the first section of the paper, essentially what I tried to do is not rely on the buzzword of industrial policy per se, but it's to really underline country interests vary when it comes to receiving that industrial policy from the US. Because the industries that you are involved in, they have to do directly with the livelihood of your own people. In the second section, the approach to economic security from the South Korean perspective, I divided into leadership and public and private sectors. The private sector is the most directly hit by the export controls, although yes, the Samsung and SK Hynix, they've received continuous waivers. They're indefinite waivers because the VEU system, the verified end user from the Department of Commerce perspective, I think it sort of gives some relief to Samsung and SK Hynix because yes, they can operate in China. Yes, they can expand to a certain extent, but they can't expand beyond 5% for advanced semiconductors in China. So what's going to happen to their profits? What's going to happen to the overall game plan for semiconductor players? That's the real question. And mind you, during the pandemic, there was a lot of pressure from the US side to have Japan and South Korea work together towards a common goal regarding semiconductors. And we've seen through Camp David, was it last month? I'm blinking because I'm jet lagged. Camp David summit, yes, it was symbolic. But what I see from the domestic side in South Korea is a series of legislations that pertain to protecting South Korea's semiconductors and to foster the future generation semiconductor industry. Because South Korea, for all we know, memory chips, they're a forte for South Korea. But system semiconductors, design, fabless, these are areas that South Korea needs to work on, in addition to packaging and testing. TSMC is very good at it. There are some companies in the US that work on it. Testing and packaging would be very, very central to future generation semiconductors. So especially because South Korea's economy depended heavily on semiconductor exports, the industrial policy directions of the US, they came as a shock to the major players in South Korea because they operate also in China. The Chips and Science Act, the subsidies, they come with guardrails for no further expansion to a certain degree, and they were confirmed a while ago, about a month ago. The BIS export controls that were additionally announced yesterday that pertain to no sales of, say, NVIDIA's chips, H100, A100 chips, to countries even to like Saudi Arabia or the UAE, they pertain to containing AI development using those chips, generative AI, essentially, because the UAE currently has something called Falcon's AI. It's their own generative AI. Saudi Arabia developed its Arabic language-oriented generative AI model, and it's called Alam. And there is more possibility of looking at this from the lens of export controls because they couldn't have done it without NVIDIA's chips. They couldn't have done it with Chinese engineers. So this is how I see it from other countries' perspectives. In addition, to just detail a little bit more on the legislative front from the South Korean perspective, the K-CHIPS Act, it's akin to it's not necessarily the same context as the Chips and Science Act because South Korea already has manufacturing of chips. EU Chips Act also slightly different because it does not preclude certain players, but K-CHIPS Act is essentially about it's about revising the existing law on placing special conditions for subsidies. It means that if you're a large conglomerate, small company working on these emerging technologies, especially on semiconductors, you get a tax cut. If you're going to expand, do it now because we will incentivize, the government will incentivize. But within domestic spheres, there were considerations about the lacking subsidies, because if you compare across the board, Taiwan, the US, China, they all have different percentages. Absolute figures, they were also very different. So Korea has that concern. K-CHIPS Act, yes, it's a direction toward industrial policy of its own, renewed version in South Korea's post-developmental state. But it's not enough, is what the industry is saying. Then there are two other acts that are really essential. One is called the Enforcement Decree of the Act on Prevention of Divulgence, this is long, and Protection of Industrial Technology. So you just need to know that there's a law on protecting industrial technology, sorry. This is across the board, 75 different kinds of technologies. And when you look at it from the semiconductor perspective, it's a broad spectrum. And the law mandates players of the private sector, public sector, to keep an eye on the industries that are crucial to South Korea's semiconductor future. And the third one is relatively new. It's called the Act on Special Measures for Strengthening the Competitiveness of and Protecting National High-Tech Strategic Industries. And there are only a handful of technologies that were selected, and amongst them, 8 technologies within semiconductors. This includes stacking, displays, because OLED panels, essentially it's a South Korean forte, then batteries and biopharmaceuticals. If you look through the list that I provided in the paper, which would be published in paper form, you would be able to see the translated version of these specific technologies. And I will leave it to you to investigate that specific arena, especially if you are an engineer studying here. So there's a little bit of difference between the second one and the third one, because the third act, which is rather recent, is set to expand. Troy mentioned in his remarks some algorithms, and Korea may place algorithms in this law in the future. If countries are trying to do responsible AI, algorithms will have to be to their jurisdiction, specifically owing to jurisdictional restrictions or directions. So I'm going to try to wrap it up by giving some policy implications here. US industrial policy, in essence, it may be politically popular, it may be the drive for the US to go forward, but there are many, many criticisms on this, because even just looking at the Taylor plant or the Arizona plant, TSMC plant, Taylor plant is the second one for Samsung, which is adjacent to here. The Ohio Intel plant, what are we witnessing? We don't even have a specific line of workers who are ready to work there. Water, electricity, these are critical issues for South Korea's Yongin cluster, the K-chip cluster that will come about in a matter of years. But in the US, it seems that the infrastructure for capital plus the talent is the crucial question here. So in the longer run, there has to be more money put towards talent acquisition or talent rearing, but I don't really see that in the US Chips and Science Act. It's rather for 38 billion for manufacturing. And going forward, South Korea and other countries may follow suit in response to the US industrial policy, because some of the components entail protectionism. So each time the US announces something, countries will have to appear defensive. They want to be clearly drawn to the fact that we have industries, we want to protect it ourselves, and we need to make laws to protect them. So those are some of the responses from the South Korea perspective that I think are important when it comes to industrial policy. And I think that Dr. Suzuki will take us to the Tokyo perspective.
Thank you, Jun. Dr. Suzuki, please.
Right. So first of all, thank you very much for inviting me I especially thank for the University of Texas at Austin and holding this very interesting workshop, and also KEI for inviting me and doing this project. So my paper is basically focusing on the concept of de-risking and how this applies to Japanese economic security programs. And Japanese economic security has been sort of one of the harbingers of the economic security argument, because Japan was the only country which has the law which titles the economic security, and we have a minister who is responsible for the economic security. The origin of the economic security argument in Japan is coming from the 2010, the Chinese decision of stopping an export of the rare earth mineral to Japan as a result of some sort of a incident that happened around the Senkaku Island, which is a disputed territory between Japan and China. The Chinese fishing boat has collided with the Japanese Coast Guard vessels, and then Japanese Coast Guard arrested the captain of the fishing boat, and then China used the economic coercion as the pressure to release the captain, and eventually Japan did. So that was the basic understanding, that China is using these economic coercive measures for not related to the incident at all. I mean, the fishing territorial dispute has nothing to do with the rare earth mineral, but it is simply because China stopped the export of rare earth mineral because that Japan depend heavily on it. Heavily depend on China for the supply of the rare earth mineral. So in that regard, the vulnerability is the dependence, or dependence is a vulnerability. If you depend heavily on the China or any potential adversarial countries, then that may leave a lot of rooms for the China or Russia to manipulate your position in the international relations, and then they would use for the political purposes. So it is not certain that China is definitely use these choke points, but it is the risk that the relationship between Japan and China will change because of the dependency. So de-risking means that you reduce the risk of other countries, particularly China, to use these leverages that may push the economic pressure as the political pressure. And weaponization of these dependence is the major concerns for Japan. So the concept of Japanese economic security has evolved since then. And then the pandemic took place, and then there were several occasions. With regard to the relationship with South Korea, Japan has also used the economic coercive measures to change the South Korean policy in 2019, to change the export control regulations, to delist from so-called white country, which is the sort of a relaxed export control system, export control licensing to South Korea, and putting 3 items, including hydrogen fluoride, which is essential for South Korea to use to develop its own semiconductor industry. So this was also being a certain. There are certain consequences of this decision. One, it was worsen the relationship with South Korea, and 2, but it has a certain pressure on the South Korean government, but nevertheless, it didn't achieve the goal that Japan wanted to achieve. So Japan also regard that it is very difficult for exercising such an economic coercion to other countries. So the South Korean case is the only case that we can recognize that Japan used the economic leverage against others. But that shows that Japan is capable of using such a leverage against the other countries. So in that regard, there is a sort of an understanding in Japan that the economy is no longer away from the politics. Economy is integrated as a part of politics, and there is no more separation between the economy and the politics, or economy and the security. So therefore, the economic security is all about in the context of the security policy. December 2022, Japan has renewed its national security strategy, and in this national security strategy, the economic security has integrated as a part of the security strategy. So in order to reduce the dependency on China or any other countries, then Japan has established the Economic Security Promotion Act, or ESPA, in May 2022. This has 4 pillars. One is to strengthen the resilience of the supply chain, which identifies the strategic important material or strategic important items, which is designated 11 items, including semiconductor, batteries, and biochemicals, and also to encourage the Japanese companies to provide an incentives for Japanese companies to reduce the dependence on China and elsewhere, and to encourage the reshoring or friendshoring, to move the supply chain, diverse supply chain, to third countries, which is more friendlier to Japan. And also the second pillar was the strengthening of the protection of the critical infrastructure. And this is actually the second time that Japan has identified the critical infrastructure, and this is traffic, financial flows, financial systems, etc. So those operators of these critical infrastructure have to report to the government for their procurement, planning for their equipment and services, for the maintenance and so on. So if there are some questionable suppliers or questionable companies involved in the supply chain and the maintenance system, maintenance operations, then the government has the right to revoke the contracts and then punishes the operators. The third pillar is the concealment of the patents, because Japan for many years have not been having a framework to conceal the patents or a technology that is closely related to the security and the weapons development. So there are cases that we recognize that North Korea is using the Japanese patents or they use the public resources to learn the Japanese technologies to improve their missile technologies. And the fourth is to strengthen the science and technology basis, and this is to make sure that Japan will improve its indispensability. So in the context of the Japanese economic security policy, there is two keywords. One is the strategic autonomy, and this is perhaps not too difficult to understand. I mean, to reduce the dependency of the others and to increase and diverse the supply chain and increase the dependence on the trustable suppliers. But the other keyword is the strategic indispensability, which means that to build the indispensable to build the technology and industrial capabilities to be indispensable in the supply chain, so that we'll be having our own leverages when it comes to the sort of a security issues. So this is a rather offensive measures rather than the defensive measures. But most of the cases, the Japanese economic security policy is defensive. And I explain in my paper about the using the word of deterrence as and how this applies to the economic security argument. The deterrence by denial is perhaps similar to the strategic autonomy discussion. Strategic autonomy is basically to improve the resilience, so that no matter how much that the others, other countries like China is trying to use that leverage to push down Japan by stopping their export or stopping their imports. But still, if we have a diversification of the supply chain, we'll be able to resist those attacks. But on the other hand, the deterrence by punishment is somewhat very ineffective, because on the one hand, the punishment does not really produce the end result that you're willing to have. The 2019 South Korean case is a good good case that even though Japan tried to change the South Korean policy, but it didn't. Well, we have to wait until the South Korean regime change or the change of government took place, and new President Yoon has a completely different stance on the relationship with Japan, and which eventually leads to the amendment to reduce the tension between Japan and South Korea, and eventually Japan has taken out this measures on the export control, and so as the South Korea has withdrawn its cases to the WTO. So the offensive measures like deterrence by punishment does not really produce some cases. However, the one form of the economic coercion is the economic sanctions, and the economic sanctions also rarely bear the fruit, but sometimes it does, and that's the case of the sanctions on Iran. And I was a member of the panel of experts on the sanctions on Iran in the United Nations until 2015, but all the way to the end of the Iran nuclear deal. And this was the case that the sanctions worked, because there are cases that the economic pressure has turned into the political pressure, and that was the case. And the third deterrence was the institutional deterrence, and I think this is something that is different from the military deterrence in the nuclear or military deterrence. But it is the case that the WTO, or using this institutional framework like WTO or CPTPP or any other institutions that may raise the cost of violating those rules, and which prevent and prohibit the use of economic coercive measures. So my conclusion is that even though Japan is taking a de-risking policy, it is still not enough to deter other countries to change their policy structure. And especially because of the lack of the institutional deterrence, which means the weakening and malfunctioning of WTO, and now we don't have enough institutional framework to include China in this network. The institutional deterrence, which by no means saying that this is a perfect tools, but this will increase the cost for China to violate and to use the economic coercive measures to Japan and other countries. So my suggestion is that we need to reinstate the power of WTO and make sure that we will have enough the institutional deterrence to contain and maintain the stability and the predictability in the international economic order. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Suzuki. Minister Yeo, would you like to
Yes.
respond?
Good afternoon. First of all, I would like to thank to University of Texas and KEI for organizing this wonderful event. Actually, while I was walking to this conference center today, I was really, amazed by this beautiful campus and also such blue sky. I mean, I haven't really seen such blue sky in a long time. And also, I'd like to wish you good luck this Saturday. I hope to see Texas beating Houston. And I guess now that you beat Alabama, so it should be no problem. With that, on a serious note, I think these two papers by Dr. Park and Dr. Suzuki, very interesting and contains a lot of informative facts and observation, and I think each paper will have a lot to offer to this ongoing discussion on economic security. And I think these two papers are complementary to each other, because economic security is such a really big concept that there's a many different perspective on how to see this economic security, especially Dr. Park focused on sort of industrial policy aspect. I'll explain why the industrial policy becomes really so important from economic security point of view, especially focusing on semiconductor. And Dr. Suzuki focuses on this de-risking. This is buzzword in the region these days, and also economic cohesion. So in that sense, I think these two papers complement to each other. First on Dr. Park's, and I'll provide some comments and questions to Dr. Suzuki as well, and then also I will conclude with my own perspective on economic security. First, on Dr. Park, I think she kind of laid out a lot of these legislations going on in Korea related to industrial policy, or strengthening this industrial competitiveness. And I think it has two components. One is promotion, and the other is protection. On this, the promotion, obviously nowadays with starting from the U.S., every country is trying to bring back the manufacturing, so-called reshoring, from the previous globalization or the offshoring or outsourcing trend. So this, now we are facing this new trend of the reshoring and the renaissance of this manufacturing sector. So I think this logical policy response from these major industrialized countries is to really strengthen their industrial base and really maintain competitive edge in these some of these core technologies and industries. So that's where this so-called KIEP Act and other these industrial policy components are coming from in Korea. But actually, Korea and Japan has been really long in this industrial policy. I mean, even from several years ago, when I discussed this issue with some of officials from US or European Union, they were really hesitant about this concept of industrial policy. But now it's just really striking to see that the US is really embracing this industrial policy, and likewise the European Union. And then this new trend of industrial policy is coming from the West, not from Asia. So I think this is really interesting development. And then second, this protection. You have to protect your competitive edge, the technologies. So this is sort of, I think, from my perspective, a new area in Korea. I mean, we didn't really pay attention to this protecting our, the technology theft and also industrial espionage, etc. But now we are facing more and more increasing anecdote from companies that, government has to step in, have to really, strengthen this legal or administrative regime to strengthen the protection of industrial technology. So that is something that, kind of a new development that I'm observing. And the question that I wanted to ask Dr. Park is that in her paper, she actually kind of explain, kind of highlight some of the risks and challenges coming from this very active industrial policy in the U.S. and how that is affecting these other, the industrialized countries like Korea or Japan on a receiving end. But actually, if we go back a bit further, I think this, you may have heard of this Made in China 2025. There was a sort of a starting point. I think that really alarmed many countries in the Western, countries, and they began to really reassess whether, they really should take this industrial policy more actively. So I'm curious how, this Dr. Park sees this risk and challenges involved with the Chinese industrial policy from economic security perspective. And on the Dr. Suzuki's point, the report, I think Japan has been leading in this economic policy, economic security policies and discussion. And then I think this de-risking vis-a-vis decoupling, I think it has legitimate the rationale in the region, because if you depend too much of your economic, the activities on certain, one country or, very small group of country, I think that interdependence becomes vulnerability, not just to your economic, well-being, but also to your national security. So in that sense, I think de-risking, despite kind of a really overblown, nature, I think it has really relevance in the region from my perspective. But I'm curious about the reaction from Japanese business sector, because when I look at the data from Japanese, for example, foreign direct investment flow from Japan to China, or whether there's any noticeable movement from Japanese companies in China trying to move away or relocate to third countries in Indo-Pacific. I think data doesn't really show kind of a distinct pattern of the new trend. So Dr. Suzuki explained a lot in detail about this economic security legislation, and looks like there's a lot of component that the private sector have to take a lead. Looks like there's a certain strategic sectors, and the government made the funding available. So the private sector companies have to identify the opportunities and they have to apply for this funding, etc. So they are the one who make things happen on the ground. So how do you see that these Japanese companies really recognizing the risk from this economic security and really moving accordingly in the government's policy responses? And then I also pose this question to the panelists about this bilateral relations between Korea and Japan. From this economic security perspective, because each paper kind of emphasize its own perspective from each country. But how do you see this potential for cooperation in this economic security sector between Korea and Japan? Because this really tumultuous relations between two countries has been a really strategic loss to the United States as well in its Indo-Pacific strategy. So the reason why I asked this question is that Korea, Japan, if you let me use some analogy here. I see that Korea and Japan has been kind of sitting from across from across from each other. And then when you face to face, I think, the differences and difficulties tend to be more emphasized. But if you sit together like this, side by side, and then look in the same direction, you find that there's a lot of commonality or kind of win-win, cooperation that you can pursue. So I think it's time for this Korea-Japan relations to shift gear, by changing seat from like facing to face, just bilateral context, to more multilateral. Because I think that's what the world needs from Korea and Japan. For example, 5 minutes. Okay. So, for example, in that sense, I see that this economic security, the agenda is really promising. Opportunity for cooperation between Korea and Japan to the interest of United States as well. For example, the Korea and Japan is a really strong allies of United States in the region, but also Korea, Japan, their number one trading partner is China, right? And but also, but Korea and Japan don't want to, take sides. I mean, of course, we are, undisputable. I mean, these allies and partners sharing the same value, democracy, the market, etc. But I mean, you don't want to antagonize big your neighbor, in your neighborhood, So I think we need to find some ways to really find common prosperity and peace in the region by balancing out, between this kind of tricky relation. And I think Korea and Japan can play important role in that regard. So some of the missing point from these two papers from economic the security perspective is that, for example, industrial policy, when the United States put forward this Inflation Reduction Act, the last summer, summer of last year, I think there has been really outcry, from many allied countries. And then Korea, Japan faced the same problem, but I think they, rather than joining forces to really rectify this problematic, the feature of the IRA, I think, this country just, respond on its own, which weren't really effective. And when it comes also, and the economic cohesion, for example, as Dr. Suzuki mentioned, 2010, Japan experienced this rare earth economic cohesion. Korea experienced in 2016, when, allied, Korea, US, deployed the THAAD missile system in Korea. We faced huge economic retaliation from China, So, but in those cases, we just responded on a separately on its own, which weren't really effective. But if, let's say, next year or a few months down the road, Korea or Japan face similar economic cohesion from whatever country, then what do we do? Obviously, during this crisis moment, it's a matter of weeks or a matter of months. You cannot really, cope with the situation on your own. That's why we realize that the international cooperation is so critical, in coping with this, economic cohesion. But how can we do it? For example, in case of Japan, Dr. Suzuki mentioned G2. As a possible, forum for international cooperation. You mentioned kind of G7 or WTO or something like that. But you didn't really mention Indo-Pacific economic framework, for example. It's going, on the negotiation right now, and then there's a supply chain pillar. And so I'm curious about how you think about this, and also trade policy, CPTPP. Now Korea is out of CPTPP as United States, but at least Korea is trying to get in. But now I think there were times when Japan wasn't really enthusiastic about Korea, coming in to, CPTPP. But now is China knocking on the door constantly. And then what is the strategic, benefit? Japan to the Japan's strategic benefit, whether Korea is in or out of, CPTPP. That's also what Japan needs to think about. Also, energy security is critical. Korea, Japan, more than 90% we import from overseas. So, and LNG, I mean, we are one of the biggest, largest importers of LNG. Especially Korea is the #1 importer of LNG from the United States. So what can we do in this the energy security era? So there are many areas that we can think about from this economic security angle. So let me stop here. Okay.
Thank you, Minister. You've all made my job very easy. You've stayed within the bounds of time. So we do, of course, want to get questions from the audience. Before I do that, I want to give June and Kazuto a chance to respond. And correct me if I've mischaracterized your questions, but specifically to June, Minister Yeo asked about sort of other non-US drivers or risks, particularly from China, that are motivating what you examine in your paper, South Korea's own effort towards economic security. And Kazuto, where was it? I've taken many notes here. The response of Japanese business, the Japanese firms, right? The data shows that it doesn't necessarily reveal that they're pulling investments out, that it's not following the signals from the government and legislation. So what's your read on that? Maybe we'll start with that. Start with those two questions.
Right.
Yes.
Okay. So thank you for those comments, Minister Yeo. And when you study semiconductors, and I've had to start as a trade expert from 2019, I had to start working on semiconductors because of the Japanese export controls. And looking back, I'm thinking that when we discuss economic security issues concerning semiconductors, if we just confine it to semiconductors per se, let's not talk about renewables at this point. I think that we forget how cutthroat this industry is. If you don't make revenue, you are out. And what appears to me as a risk, the challenges and the risks, it's not just China, it's about keeping your industry afloat. Because if you don't make sales, you're just going to be wiped out. So one thing that I always find striking when it comes to discussing semiconductors is, yes, you want to counter some of the advanced nodes technology to China, because at the end of the day, it would be intercepting and launching missiles driven by AI chips, all of those military risks. Yes, they're geopolitical risks. The challenge is, though, if you don't keep your industry afloat, you're going to lose anyway. So it's a chicken and egg game. You need to choose which fight you're going to win. And that's not really easy because industries are the backbone of the economy. And the reason why I emphasize industries in Korea is because semiconductors have always been the pillar of South Korean economy for decades now. And now it's facing the realities of having to realize, okay, maybe this is not going to be the case anymore. Maybe we need to develop other industries, because chances are, if we don't stay in this game, we may not continue to prosper and foster new industries. Because if you just rely on semiconductors per se, who knows, like within 10 years, 20 years, you're not going to be at the front of the game anymore. So those are the challenges. Geopolitical risk, yes, there is. Challenges, you have to keep on gaining revenue in order to keep your industries afloat. And one more thing about the competitive edge. I think that, within the US, there has been already discussion, complaints by companies like NVIDIA, Intel, AMD on these measures. And it's just really difficult to see where the industry is headed. If they deploy the export controls, is it really going to be the case that these export controls contain China's progression? Or is it going to be another breakthrough technology that China comes up with? We don't know that. So while I'm not discounting the need for containing the risk, I'm genuinely concerned about the maintenance of the industrial or competitive edge that each country has.
Dr.
Okay. Um, Ms. Liaos, thank you very much. I think, well, let me just answer your question first. It seems that from the data, Japanese foreign direct investment or relocation does not take in place immediately because, first of all, the nature of FDI is that it is very difficult to move. I mean, once you invested, build the factory or the breaking point is like 5 years, and then these installations usually goes on like 20, 30 years. So if you move, then that is a huge cost for the Japanese industry. So basically, it's not going to happen immediately, but nevertheless, the nature of the role of these Chinese factories, the factories in China, is changing. Mostly in the past, there are certain R&D roles in China, and these companies employ Chinese engineers to involve in the R&D, but these are now quickly dismissing. I mean, the factories in China is now becoming as an assembly tools and not really doing the R&D. Most of the R&D coming back to the home grounds. And also, I am running a think tank called the Institute of Geoeconomics, and we have a number of the corporate members which are in need of the consultancies for the economic security issues. And, so we have a very sort of daily contact with the Japanese industry. And it seems that, they are extremely serious about the risks that may pose by China, but at the same time, they are very concerned about, leaving the very large market, which is growing at, even though in the times of the economic economic downturn, still, China is growing like 3 to 4%. And this is the area that you don't want to miss. So, so the key concept is the small yard, high fence. I mean, what the Japanese Economic Security Promotion Act is trying to aim at is to limit the to identify what are the strategic items, which are the areas that you don't have to step in. So semiconductor, it's not all semiconductor that we are talking about. It's the high-end semiconductor, which is less than 16, 14 nanometers. So these are the area where you don't need to step in. I mean, make sure that you retreat from China, but the rest of the semiconductor, it's okay to trade with China. And even China is investing in this domain, like 20 nano chips, so that the area in this category is becoming more and more competitive. So Japan needs to be more competitive, and in order to do so, we may need to invest in China to a certain extent. But that is what Japanese government is trying to do, to make sure that how to limit the and to identify the strategic items so that it will not harm the normal industrial activities, and make Japanese company competitive, remain competitive in the field of even semiconductor. So the reason why it takes a long time after the United States announced the export control on the semiconductor against China in October last year, and then oh, by the way, it's just 1 year since it was announced, but it took more than 6 months for Japan to agree on the US demand for limiting the Japanese export on the semiconductor manufacturing equipment. that is because it took a while to negotiate with the companies like Tokyo Electron and make sure that which product is the one under the control, and to make sure that these products needs to be controlled, and meanwhile the other products are free to go. So that was the negotiation between Japan and the companies to limit and draw a line where the security, which one is a security relevant issues and which are not. So I think in that regard, the Japanese are now dealing with this economic security seriously, and we are making that differences. So it's not appear on the data, but there is a change.
Just very quickly, Minister Yod also asked about bilateral cooperation between Japan and the ROK, and this, I think, directed to both of you, and you paint a good picture rather than standing opposed to one another, alongside one another. I think, I might proffer one potential part of the answer you just alluded to, Dr. Suzuki, is that each government needs to negotiate with their own private industry and firms in order to tailor their response, which is, that takes its own amount of time. But now that we are in this general trend, for both of you, what do you see as opportunities or prospects for deeper Japan-South Korea cooperation?
On semiconductors?
Just broadly economic security.
I think military cooperation wise, I think the trilateral scheme or information sharing per se for military purposes, I think that's ideal. But as I mentioned in my previous comments, the buildup of foundries in Japan. So if TSMC gets involved in Rapidus, or if TSMC grows clout in the Kumamoto plant, I mean, consumers from the Japanese side, it would be mainly Sony and some other companies that need to have access to chips. But there is growing tension. There will be growing tensions if it becomes a threat to the South Korean foundries. So what I'm trying to highlight is that, yes, there is a need for the two countries to collaborate, but we must never forget that the chip industry is something of only a cooperation game, because there's essentially the rules of the game is that you need to generate revenue with excellent technology, you need to get ahead, and to stay afloat, you need that revenue to be maintained. And if in the case that the way I see the buildup of Rapidus in Hokkaido is Tokyo Electron, IBM, they needed another sort of set of model that is not TSMC, that is not Samsung, that is geopolitically risk-free. But there's no guarantee it could be risk-free. It's just that we need an alternative model that's not Taiwan, that's not South Korea. To me, it seems that yes, it could be a start for Japan to regain competitive edge on semiconductors, but we don't know how that's going to go. We don't know how these export controls in China would go, because China, look at their Huawei, rate 60. Like some of the things that are not really fitting in with the direction that the Commerce Department has been lining up in terms of the export controls. And China has abundant, we have to recognize that China has abundant resources, abundant talent in order to achieve their goals. So those are things that we have to accept. We can't just deny and sit and watch and say, hey, these are the elements that we have to preserve in terms of national security, and these are okay. So these are, it's a concern for every single country, but Japan, Korea collaborating, it's not going to solve the China problem. This is how I see it, maybe pessimistic.
I wouldn't think that, Japan, Korea is doing something for deny China or, to outline China or to put China sideline from semiconductor industry. I think, the economic security or these economic coercion can take place in multiple fronts. And I think what is needed is to have a bilateral or multilateral cooperation to make sure that, to reduce the dependency on China. But the problem between Japan and South Korea is that we do have a very similar industrial structure. So there are companies competing each other, and that is not really helping for the cooperation for the economic security. Because economic security, on the one hand, is the security matter, which requires the intergovernmental cooperation, but also the economic security is an economic issue. So we need to have the company's involvement. So individual states, individual governments needs to talk to their own industry and to make sure that what needs to be done. But I think what is important between Japan and South Korea at the governmental level is not to distort the competitive environment in the name of the economic security. And this is what happens in the United States. In the name of the economic security, the United States is taking a relatively, or I would say, protectionist measures. So IRA, the requirements for building having a factory in the North America and make sure that all the batteries have to be made in the North America. That's, let's say, to be honest, it's a protectionist. And that's not really an economic security for all. It's an economic interest or the industrial policy for United States. And that's not beneficial for South Korea, Japan, or neither Europe. And that's not what we need for the economic security. And we are not facing the competition against China and a strategic competition against China. And that is, industrial competition against Chinese companies. So if you want to play like that, then that's not really good for the alliance and intergovernmental cooperation, because at the end of the day, the companies are competing each other. The Japanese companies, Chinese companies, US companies are all competing in the electric vehicles market, and the United States is using the governmental policies to give a preference to the industry, US industry for the largest market for the EV vehicle, electric vehicle. So I think between Japan and South Korea, I think this is the most important thing, to make sure that we are not going to distort the competitiveness. And I think it was the right thing for Japan to withdraw the export control, which was imposed in 2019, and South Korea withdraw its cases against Japan in WTO. So I think these are the sort of a way forward, and that's the economic security for both of us.
Thank you. So you may have follow-up questions, Minister Yeo, but I do want to turn to the audience. If you do have a question, please raise your hand, and we would ask that you use a mic, which will be this mic. So just, okay. Thank you.
Hello, thank you, panelists, Dr. Park, Dr. Suzuki, Dr. Han-koo. I'm Deepshikha Arora. I'm a student here at the LBJ School, specializing in international trade. So regarding the conclusion that you reached, Dr. Suzuki, that we need to strengthen WTO and international institutions, and you mentioned that the recent steps taken by the United States in terms of the IRA and other acts are protectionist measures. Do you see a scenario where the WTO can be brought back to its strength, or do you think there is still scope for free trade and competition? question.
Right. Should I answer? Please do. The best way for bringing back the WTO in strength is first, the United States will commit to the WTO rules, and second, to reform WTO. I think one of the reasons why the United States is critical about the way in which that the WTO works is its weakness of bringing China in to comply with the WTO rules. The problem is that China has exempted a lot of things because it was registered as a developing country in WTO, and that was the decision in Clinton administration as well as the Bush administration to allow China in the WTO, and that was a condition. So it was the mistake in the end of 1990s, and it was now, everyone is paying the price for that. And I think it is wrong to blame WTO. And I think what we need to do is to have a practical way of reforming WTO while the United States is committing to it.
Thank you, everyone. Can you hear me? Yeah. Thank you to everyone on the panel. My name is Larry O'Brien. I'm an alumnus of the LBJ School here at UT. My question for the panelists is, given the significant investment, FDI and so forth, and trade relations with both Japan and Korea with China, how exposed are the two countries to intellectual property theft, industrial espionage? And how does that risk balance against the objectives both for Japan and Korea themselves and for working with the United States insofar as the export controls and other measures that have been discussed?
Do we collect or we go?
You know what, let's, in the interest of time, let's collect a few more. I saw that over here, there was one, and did you have your hand up?
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you so much for being here. My question was for all of you, but Dr. Park had mentioned kind of the linking of economic security with national and military security as well. And my question is, at what point do you see an economic coercion situation becoming a threat to the point where military security and our allied relationships need to become involved from a military perspective? So I guess my question is, typically you would see economic coercion as a little bit of a softer power. At what point does especially the dependence from Japan and Korea on, for example, energy market become a tipping point where military involvement, you see that might cross the line into requiring that level of security or response?
Energy in terms of gas, oil, or renewable?
Yeah, any of the really strategically critical.
Hi. So I'm a businesswoman and an investor here in Austin and back in Korea. And my question or my thought is, one of the weaknesses of democracies is a relative short-term thinking that's baked into 4- or 5-year presidential or prime ministerial elections. My question here is, for every change of administration, has there been a change of policies on a national security and related to economic security, or because of the survivalist nature of this issue, is it both bipartisan and does it stay consistent, whatever the political swing it takes?
Maybe we'll navigate that set of questions and then maybe take some more after.
Okay, so I'll try to answer them briefly so that Professor Suzuki also can have a go. With regard to the first question, so intellectual property theft has been an ongoing thing between China and South Korea bilaterally. And most of the time, if you try to install a factory in China, you come out empty-handed or you come in loss. You return to Korea in loss. Samsung closed their TV production lines. It's a very good example of that. And if you look at BOE, right? BOE, in terms of display manufacturing in China as well, you always have the danger of some intellectual or technological spill. Given that, you still need that market. So chicken and egg, we always say. And I would say this probably applies to every single country that operates production lines in China. The thing is, though, you need to give it time so that you have an exit plan. And that exit plan, under the current rules that the US is embodying, is not really there. And if you want to exit from China, then the US has to provide some carrots. And given the guardrails, given the CHIPS and Science Act subsidy regulations, it's not really visible. IRA, in some ways, yes, because there are some subsidies that are given to, it's actually lucrative for companies that are already here, especially in battery production. But I see the intellectual property conversations to be a constant thing as we go on, as the US and China jostle over, power. So you have a point in there. So with regard to the economic coercion, whether there is a drawing line, especially when it comes to energy markets. So when I try to see these three big powers, so Russia, China, the US has the biggest demand for capital and revenue gain, whereas China has this thirst for energy resources in general. And I see Russia as more territorial in terms of, their desire to expand or retrieve, according to whatever Putin says. So China continues to consume. And if you just look at the oil and gas markets, you can sense that most of the exports from the Gulf, they are headed towards China, and they cannot live without China anymore. So look at the Saudis, look at the Emiratis, look at the Qataris. It's an ongoing thing. Where to draw that line has become very, very nebulous because of the Ukraine war. Winter is coming, and what we see in the Middle East right now, it has to be linked with some of the energy concerns coming from Europe. Not the two confrontations per se, but with regard to Iran. And I think that when you think about economic coercion, it can no longer be considered as a soft tactic anymore, because we have essentially three wars now: US-China competition, Ukraine, and Middle East. So I don't know if that answers your question, but there is no clear drawing line anymore, although I do sense that in terms of policy response to the US industrial policy, some countries are taking it more independently in terms of preserving their economic interest. And that's the point that I wanted to deliver, because it's not really fleshed out in the policy world.
Because I think tough question remains. I think to answer to your question, I think it's really that's true that in many anecdotal cases of different countries, we see that because of the kind of elections and the election cycle and the short nature of this sort of important policy, whether it's just security or economy, it's kind of swing back and forth. But I think also the strength of democracy is a resilience. I mean, although, that policy may stray a bit, but you have resilience from the bottom up to, bring it back to, stay the course. So I think that's the general answer that I can, a general observation I can share.
I completely forgot about her question. Can I just say something? Yeah. Okay, so with regard to Korea, I think Korea is in shambles. So each night I have to watch the news. I can't focus on substance. It's something that's immaterial. It's something that's between the two large parties, and the public is lost trying to focus on which substance to focus on. And I think that really eats away at the capacity of the country, be it industry or, and I see this similar things in the US too, in democracies in general, because maybe it's something that gives room for people to discuss, but we're not paying attention to what's really crucial to our lives. So I think it needs to be fixed, but I don't know where that can be fixed.
Sorry, but I have a kidney problem, so like, or something it's hard to control. Okay, the first question is about industrial espionage. I think industrial espionage takes place whether you invest or not in China. The industrial espionage took place when a recent case that the Industrial Research Institute called ICE has hired the Chinese researcher on the chemical component research, and then it was he was acting as an agent to leak the industrial intellectual property to China, and that happens whether you invest or not. And the local Chinese local companies, that the Japanese local companies, it has a problem that there is a lot of harassments and changes of the regulations by Chinese government, the central and provincial government regulations on the disclosure of the industrial secrets, like source code, etc. And that is not only targeting Japan, but also all foreign companies investing in China, so including Europeans, Americans, South Koreans. So that is open espionage. It's not espionage at all. I mean, it's just a forcing to disclose all the trade secrets, and the Chinese government have the. Well, usually it doesn't happen, but it happens anyway, because Chinese government has the power to do so. So if you don't comply with those regulations, then you won't have a chance to operate in Chinese market. So either way, investing in China is a risk, and that's why I said in response to the Minister Yao's comments that Japanese industry is now retreating all the technical elements, and they're trying to retreat the R&D components from China. The second, I don't think the economic security turns into a military security. I mean, there is a threshold between how much you bear the economic loss and how much you bear the military or the loss of human lives or the territorial integration. So basically, in Japan, for that matter, is not capable of retaliating economic pressure by the military forces because of our constitution doesn't allow it to do so. And usually it is very difficult to identify what is about the business competition and what is about the national security. And yes, the economic coercion is a very soft form of the economic activities, but at the same time, there are certain rules and rules of engagement, which is to bring the case to WTO, for example. And if you cannot get the sort of a positive outcome or the expected outcome from the WTO, but that's not the reason that you can use the military forces. So I don't think the economic security or economic coercion will justify the use of forces in any case. So basically, the use of force is prohibited by the international rules and UN Charter, which is now being again another headache because of the Russian invasion and what happened in Palestine and Israel. In terms of the consistency, I don't know. I mean, there is a lot of inconsistency by the government, and one of the reasons why the Camp David agreement between Japan, South Korea, and the United States was interesting, because it was trying to establish the trilateral cooperation, even though there might be a change in the government in the United States or South Korea, because we always, I mean, Japan is a very stable in that sense that, you know, the LDP has been in power for many, many years, and there are very few occasions that we have a change of government. But you know, South Korea as well as in the United States, if there is a change of government, then there's a drastic change of policies, and that is really difficult for us to catch up with. I mean, South Korea in particular, you know, the change of government has a lot of repercussion to the bilateral relationship. So I think the institutionalization of the trilateral cooperation is important, because that will again raise the cost of such a drastic change in the relationship. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much to Drs. Park and Suzuki and Minister Yeo. Obviously, you provided a lot of feedback that we couldn't get to, but that will, I'm sure, help both our panelists sort of revise and move their papers towards publication. So we have, as was mentioned, a second panel, but we do have about a 12-minute break. We'll be starting at the hour. There is coffee, other refreshments, and cookies out in the foyer, so please go help yourself, and we will be back in just before the hour. Well, welcome back, everybody. Hopefully you got yourself a refreshment. We're going to jump right into our second panel. Before we had the views from Tokyo and Seoul, and I think it's only right that we move to an extent, a broader aperture with the views from Beijing and Washington. And just to briefly introduce the panelists next to me and our discussant on the screen. Dr. Andrea Viski, at the end of the table, is the founder and director of the Strategic Trade Research Institute, which is a board-governed nonprofit organization. Dr. Viski founded the Strategic Trade Review, a peer-reviewed journal dedicated to trade and security, in 2015, and has since served as its editor-in-chief, excuse me. She's also an adjunct professor at the Schar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University, where she teaches a course on strategic trade controls and co-developed a master's certificate on strategic trade and compliance. She directs the Trade and Investment Security Program at the Stimson Center, my former home, and is a non-resident senior scholar at the James Martin Center for Non-Proliferation Studies, where she also serves as editorial advisor for the Non-Proliferation Review. She is also an affiliated expert with CRDF Global, and she'll be presenting on her paper titled The Evolving Landscape of U.S. Economic Security, the Confluence of Trade, Technology, and National Security. And directly to my left is Dr. Audrye Wong, who is an assistant professor of political science and international relations at the University of Southern California, and Jean Kirkpatrick Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. She is a former Grand Strategy, Security, and Statecraft postdoctoral fellow at MIT's Security Studies program and the Harvard Kennedy School. And her research examines how states use non-military means, including economic and informational tools, to gain geopolitical influence. Audrey's current book project, I won't ask you how far along you are in it, analyzes the strategies and effectiveness of economic statecraft. Other projects examine authoritarian informational statecraft, foreign influence operations, and the role of diasporas in international relations. And her paper, which she'll be presenting on, is titled China's Perspectives on Economic Security. And the discussant on the screen behind us is Dr. Stephan Haggard. He is the Lawrence and Sally Krauss Professor of Korea-Pacific Studies at UC San Diego. He also serves as the university's director of the Korea-Pacific Program. He teaches courses on the international relations of the Asia-Pacific at UC San Diego School of Global Policy and Strategy, covering political economy as well as security issues. He has done extensive research on North Korea in particular. In addition, he has a long-standing interest in transitions to and from democratic rule and the current phenomenon of democratic backsliding. He is also a member of the board of directors at the Korea Economic Institute. So there's really little that Dr. Haggard hasn't researched or written on, and anybody who's a graduate student who focuses on Asia or Asia policy has come across his work almost regardless of their particular field or interest. So we'll have the same run of show as we did in the first panel, and I will ask Andrea to kick things off, and then we'll come this way.
All right. Thanks everybody for being here. Thanks to the Korea Economic Institute, the Clements Center, and the University of Austin, and also to my fellow panelists and discussant and also for inviting me to speak at this timely and important event. Before I begin my remarks, I want to give a little bit of background of why I chose trade and technology as the angle for my paper. And it has a lot to do with my background, because my background is from first nuclear security and then non-proliferation more generally. And that's how I got into the field of strategic trade controls. So a lot of the discussion of economic security, and especially the application to emerging and foundational technologies, is a little bit astounding to me over the last couple of years. And I'm going to talk a little bit about why in my remarks. But that background has really formed why I have taken the specific angle of technology and trade and focused less on other components of U.S. economic security as it is defined by U.S. agencies, for example, and protection of natural resources or cybersecurity. And the timing of this panel couldn't be more pertinent, because as I was flying here yesterday, the Department of Commerce published the new strengthened rules on advanced computing and semiconductor manufacturing items. And I'm going to, as in the previous panel, talk a little bit about the context for that and how it relates to economic security more generally in my comments. So my paper focuses on several influencing factors for and features of U.S. economic security policy, evolving notions of the dual use concept, the need to manage and respond to technology flows with more effective strategies, a new national and foreign policy efforts and tools to strengthen economic security. So first, the evolution of the dual use concept that has catalyzed the confluence of economic and national security in the US. My paper discusses how the focus on competitiveness on emerging and foundational technologies has driven the US to shift its focus on economic security as a fundamental, if not equated, face of national security. Traditional notions of the dual use concept, and the ones that I was working with in the non-proliferation field, related to identifying materials, equipment, software, and technology in relation to their potential specific military end use, whether it's in a conventional weapon system or a weapon of mass destruction. So tying that very specifically together, and in the different export control regimes that developed, all of the control lists of those regimes and the technical parameters for each control entry were very specifically tied to that military end use. But a shift in the focus and priorities of that broader dual use notion and their convergence with economic security discourse occurred pretty markedly in 2018 with the US Congress passing the Export Control Reform Act, or ECRA, as well as the Foreign Investment Risk Review Modernization Act, or FARA. So ECRA introduced the notion of competitiveness to the dual use concept, as well as other objectives of technology control and management, like the need for the US to maintain its leadership, innovation, and competitiveness in core technologies. ECRA also established an interagency process to identify both emerging and foundational technologies such as AI, robotics, quantum, and others to be controlled. But because the specific military end use of some of these emerging and especially foundational technologies is not always clear, it's not as clear as the items that were traditionally added to export control regime lists. The shift allows for policymakers to possibly justify controlling these technologies as much for issues of competitiveness and job security or others as national security ones, leading to a confluence of both notions. And the paper introduces the example of the recent export controls on semiconductors to China to underscore this shift, because it represents an expansion of managing trade and technology in the interests of national security to the wider objective of protecting U.S. interest in economic and technological power. And so the convergence of trade, technology, and national security is moving forward. So it's also interesting to note that there's an additional element to consider in the overall discussion, which is human rights. And there's also a growing intersection of human rights objectives and the U.S. view of economic security as well. And this applies also to European Union member states. And increasingly in the US, technology is managed also with a view to protecting human rights violations. And for example, looking at technologies that can be used in the surveillance of citizens and others. And we also saw this being applied in the EU in the recent reform of the dual use regulation, as well as a new US initiative on export controls and human rights. So the justification being that protecting human rights is important when it comes to technology flows. And this certainly informs the US view of economic security as well, but I think it's somewhat less discussed. Another influence that I discussed that informs the current US view of economic security is the challenge of managing intangible transfers of technology. And the focus on enabling technologies has come in parallel with the focus on how to safely and securely manage their flows, which is necessarily different from former flows. And again, the focus of export controls being on tangible goods moving from point A to point B. And the nature of technology flows and the challenge of trying to establish tools or control measures to protect domestic technology innovation squarely places the need to manage these flows at the heart of US economic security priorities. So in practice, this has meant a shift towards unilateral protection measures over domestic technology production. And in the paper, I discuss how the global multilateral playing field, which was once the primary conduit for the US to implement technology-driven security policy, has become more challenging at the level of the United Nations and other multilateral structures. And I point to two parallel developments that have led to the current US policymaking. First, rapid developments in emerging technology areas, potentially raising security and competitiveness threats. And second, the increasing inability to manage these threats through, for example, the 1540 United Nations Security Council 1540 mechanisms, or even in the export control regimes themselves. And so that has led to the US employing increasing unilateral measures. And there's examples of this in terms of, the efforts to introduce controls on additive manufacturing and some of the export control regimes, and the difficulty actually in doing that. Again, because of tensions and structural issues within the regimes, but also because of the inability to apply the threat to a specific end use, and also in a way that wouldn't hurt the competitiveness of the member states of those regimes too much. So in the next section of the paper, I talk about the US economic security toolbox. So along with the shifts of the objectives and priorities come new tools and policies. So I talk about new international frameworks and initiatives. Some of these were discussed in the previous panel. But to add to those, the US and EU Trade and Technology Council. And I also discuss US initiatives to align its policies in areas like semiconductor export controls with like-minded countries or allies. And I also talk about new structures within the United States. So lots of different new task forces and agencies that try to implement economic security policies. And then finally, I talk about the importance or significance of new pharma specifically and FDI screening, and how it's an emerging way for the US to meet its economic security objectives. And in addition to that, potential new outbound investment screening tools to also underscore its economic security priorities. And just one thing that maybe we can have in a topic to cover in the discussion is that, interestingly, a lot of the justifications that countries use in their legislation for developing or underlying their dedicated investment screening mechanisms are very much tied to the discussions that we've had on economic security. So you can almost look at the legislation of countries that have drafted or strengthened their FDI screening mechanisms for clues on how they define economic security for themselves, whether it's national security, but also the protection of the supply chain for critical inputs and critical infrastructure. Okay. So while the paper concentrates on the drivers and characteristics of implementing US economic security policy, it's important to note several factors that will ultimately influence how successful the US will be in achieving these goals. So I have a number of kind of concluding thoughts for my remarks that are within the paper, but also can provide food for thought for further discussion and thinking about evaluating how effective these policies will be. So first is, how effective can the US be without working through traditional multilateral channels? And what ramifications does that have for US allies and their partners? And what incentives do other countries have to cooperate with US policies? Many of the countries that the US would like their cooperation to implement their policies on obviously prefer traditional multilateral instruments to work within. And even the US in policy statements related to ECRA and in possibly identifying new controls on emerging technology groups to add to its export controls, as a policy statement, has said that it wants to work first through export control regimes, that's the preferred way, but that if it can't do that, then it will impose unilateral controls, which seems to be the case now with semiconductors and possibly with future controls in other technology areas. And another question is, how far will the US go in establishing these kinds of unilateral controls? We just saw yesterday the new strengthened controls for advanced semiconductor manufacturing. Are there going to be more controls in that field, and how much further will they go on a unilateral basis, and how far can allies be expected to cooperate? Another area of kind of measuring effectiveness is how can economic security policies that try to control or manage trade and technology, especially when it comes, how effective can they be when it comes to stemming other countries from their own technological development? And I think that's really interesting to consider, also because the point of export controls in the non-proliferation context, it was never with the idea that it would stop adversaries from developing, say, a weapon of mass destruction, but to make it more difficult and timely and costly for them to do so, and to allow other kinds of foreign policy tools to act in cooperation with those controls, and for them to work to achieve the broader foreign policy objective. So when you translate that into this context, the idea that it could stop, for example, China from becoming more advanced in this technology comes with the potential threat of China doubling down its efforts to develop the technology and wanting to do it more, and the controls not necessarily working in the long run. And then what effect does economic security translated into controls and management of technology? To what extent does it hurt the US economy and technological competitiveness. And something that I was thinking about with the previous panel was that the US has relied on diversity, and the US has relied on foreign workers for its own technological innovation. It's so important. But with a lot of the economic security policies, for example, visa vetting schemes and other kinds of controls on who can work in the United States, how can that actually lead to stifled innovation? And how do those two kind of parallel outcomes balance each other out in terms of technology control, but then also not having that source of innovation and diversity? And then finally, and this is the final point for my remarks, is how, what tools does the US have to actually think through benefits and risks of its economic security policies based on a broader, sound conceptual basis? And is there necessary consultation with the private sector and other stakeholders, as well as, say, impact assessments and historical looking at historical examples when it comes to considerations of policy effectiveness? So I'll stop there, and thank you again for the chance to share my remarks.
Thank you, Dr. Viski. Dr. Wong.
Yeah, thanks to KIEP and to UT Austin for inviting me here. It's been a really fascinating panel so far. So thinking about China's perspective, Chinese President Xi Jinping announced he introduced the comprehensive national security concept in 2014. He declared that it would take security as the purpose, political security as the basis, and economic security as the foundation, right? So economic security is clearly an important part of national security in Chinese leaders' thinking. And this is not a new or foreign concept to Chinese thinkers and policymakers, but there's certainly been evolution and shifts over time. So what I did in this paper is to look at primary source official documents and Chinese language scholarly writings to decipher how Beijing is thinking about economic security. So how does Beijing define economic security? A lot of discussion centers on how making sure that economic development and interests are free from internal or external threats, and also how external economic interactions can either enhance or weaken a country's sense of security in the global system. So most discussions focus on the external sources of threats, and the term that's often used is national economic security, right? 国家经济安全, right? And so it's really focusing on the national level. And thinking about China's national security. At the same time, that's in recognition that there are growing concerns about economic security is part and parcel of becoming a major economic power. So 4 headline points that I want to make today. First, the notion of economic security has shifted from primarily responding to economic vulnerabilities arising from globalization to an expanded array of concerns driven by geopolitical factors such as perceived U.S. containment and U.S.-China rivalry. Second, while Chinese discussions of economic security tend to be framed as ensuring economic development and stability, right, development is implicitly and explicitly linked to national security. So many writings emphasize that economics is the foundation for national strength, including military capabilities. And today, Xi Jinping has formalized development and security as being inextricably linked, right? That we need to coordinate, integrate these two domains, manage the trade-offs, not least in service of maintaining CCP rule and regime stability. So economic security can be seen as more than just being about development. The scope of it includes using economic tools to substitute, complement, or strengthen military tools in pursuit of national security goals. And third, while Beijing's rhetoric of self-sufficiency and its state-led industrial policies often grab headlines, right? That's a major component of China's response and China's approach to economic security. I argue that Beijing's also thinking about economic security in more nuanced ways. Economic security is seen as a natural consequence of economic growth and openness, and so the focus is on managing those added risks rather than sort of shutting China off from the rest of the world and the global economy. And this also, includes both sort of continuing the benefits of economic integration, as well as a strategy of capitalizing on China's position in the global economy to gain maximal leverage for safeguarding its own economic security, including supply chain resilience and deterring external punishment. And finally, we see Beijing taking concrete steps towards increased legalization and institutionalization of economic security measures. And so this represents a shift from its traditionally more informal approach to economic coercion, at least in the domain of retaliatory countermeasures. At the same time, actual implementation has been relatively limited thus far. So those are my 4 main takeaways. I'm now talking a little bit more about the evolution over time in China's thinking on economic security, right? Initially, I think especially in the reform era, post-1978, economic growth and national security were really conceived as 2 separate issues. And in the 90s, with the Asian financial crisis, with China's entry into the WTO, right, we see increasing discussion of what economic security is, kind of trying to wrestle with that concept. But for most of the time, right, Beijing's conceptualization was very much about weathering the risk stemming from economic openness. So how to respond to classic problems of, energy shocks, financial contagion, vulnerabilities to market demand. And so even into the early 2010s, there remained considerable optimism about favorable conditions for China's economic security and economic development. Right, but we really see a shift in the last several years, post 2012, where China is portrayed as facing an increasingly complex array of threats to national security, and by some accounts, China is now seen as being in a quote unquote critical phase. And so President Xi in a series of speeches in 2014, right, introduced the new idea of integrating development and security. And so equating these 2 concepts was a significant shift away from the development first approach that had long been declared to be the party's top priority. Right, so this new approach can be interpreted perhaps as acknowledging that there are trade-offs between development and security, right? But that safeguarding security takes priority, and that economic development should serve to enhance China's national security. And unsurprisingly, there's plenty of focus on supply chain risks and certainly on the United States as a major threat to China's economic security today, a recognition that China is still very reliant on foreign countries for core industrial components and technologies. And the US is seen as using illegal and quote unquote bullying tactics to suppress China's technological progress and economic development, targeting leading firms such as Huawei, disrupting supply chains in semiconductors, and restricting market access to stifle the commercialization and adoption of Chinese technologies more globally. And Washington is perhaps grudgingly admired for its ability to leverage its military power, its market power, and technological dominance to control access to advanced technology, and also its ability to use international organizations, U.S. companies, to implement its policies and quote unquote Americanize the structural rules of the game. And so how is Beijing thinking about responding? It's really thinking about economic dependence as a double-edged sword in 2 levels, right? So I've mentioned sort of China has experienced rapid growth, but then there's more exposure to external situations and threats. And second, right, China may face more threats to its economic security, but it can also leverage its position and draw on a broader array of tools to consolidate its own security. And so official and unofficial writings have simultaneously advocated for continued economic integration and international cooperation, alongside strengthening China's own industrial and technological capabilities. So this is really about leveraging the global economy to enhance China's economic security as a deterrent strategy. Some analysts use the term decoupling, like DEEP, not decoupling, right, to position China as a crucial node in trading and investment networks, so make it harder for other countries to cut China out of critical supply chains, right? And so when you promote deeper integration, it can also be seen as a way to divide and conquer, right, trying to reduce coordination of economic security policies between Washington, the EU, and sort of like-minded allies and partners. And a key component is, of course, to increase self-sufficiency across strategic industrial sectors. Xi Jinping has called for forging so-called assassin's maze technologies that can provide disproportionate advantage to an otherwise inferior power. So enhancing China's superiority across the entire production chain in key sectors such as high-speed rail, new energy and communications, and quote-unquote tighten international production chains dependence on China, forming powerful countermeasures and deterrents against those foreigners who would artificially cut off supply to China. Certainly, technology is seen as a key domain for economic security, especially so-called stranglehold technologies, for which China is still heavily dependent on other countries. And government has identified 35 industries, from chips to high-end steel and electronic components, as sort of areas where China needs to strengthen its own capabilities. And there's a lot of public discussion of China's industrial policy push. I won't go into too much detail here. And I want to just talk briefly about legalization measures, which I think has been a new trend in China's approaches. A lot of its rhetoric and policies is really reflecting a trend towards greater legalization and institutionalization of economic security measures. Many writings emphasize a crucial need for establishing more systemic institutional mechanisms to handle issues of economic security, right? Because these are risks that span multiple sectors. So we need greater inter-ministry and inter-provincial coordination. And we also see the expanded legalization of its economic security toolkit. President Xi previously called on China to use legal weapons in the struggle against foreign countries. I'm quoting him. And so in the last few years, we've seen Beijing adopt a spate of legal and regulatory measures. And many of these frameworks can be seen as direct countermeasures and retaliatory responses to US and EU policies, such as export controls, restrictions against Chinese companies and investments, and economic sanctions. So for example, the unreliable entity list punishes foreign companies that comply with foreign sanctions. The rules on counteracting unjustified extraterritorial application of foreign legislation is meant to counter secondary sanctions. And the export control law limits the export of dual-use and national security-related technologies, as well as reciprocal measures against foreign export controls. And at the same time, some of these legislations, such as the anti-foreign sanctions law, right, is potentially more sweeping in the range of targets, not just governments, but also organizations and individuals. It also is relatively vague, so that could potentially allow for more proactive coercion or broader regulatory discretion. And I argue that this is a shift in how Beijing is thinking about economic statecraft. Traditionally, China really rarely admits political motives when it imposes sanctions. And I have written elsewhere on how it has tended to use very informal approaches in its economic statecraft. And so expanded legalization could reflect a few factors. Chinese analysts have pointed to the valuable signaling and deterrence role of legal anti-sanctions measures amidst great power competition, right? So demonstrating sort of, China is taking the stance that is, going to respond. And legalization could also be part of a broader institutionalization of tools of economic statecraft over time. Could facilitate better coordination and enforcement, and could allow the Chinese Communist Party to claim credit in front of the domestic audience to signal a tough response to foreign coercion. And so we've seen Beijing starting to draw more explicitly on these legal tools in its economic policies. In July 2023, MOFCOM Ministry of Commerce cited the foreign trade law when announcing export controls on gallium and germanium. And in February of this year, the same ministry announced its first ever use of the unreliable entity list, designating Lockheed Martin and Raytheon over arms sales to Taiwan. And these two companies had already been previous targets of Chinese sanctions, and including through the anti-foreign sanctions law and entry bans on the company CEOs last year. And then neither of these companies really had meaningful business presence in China. And so this suggests that so far, at least these announced sanctions and countermeasures, right, serve as perhaps more of a symbolic move for signaling and deterrence purposes. And so to conclude, one Chinese scholar notes that it remains, quote unquote, difficult, if at all possible, to determine how much economic security is sufficient. And so this is a challenge that many countries and governments will face in trying to balance the tensions between open economic exchange and national security concerns. Beijing's official rhetorical elevation of the importance of national security across multiple domains suggests that the domain of economic development and growth will be increasingly viewed through a security lens. And Dr. Sheena Chestnut-Greitens here at UT Austin has written on how China's foreign policy will be increasingly guided by an assertive quest for regime security. And with the party really at the center of thinking about, taking leading role in emphasizing security over development. At the same time, this is not yet a China, I think, that is seeking to decouple from the global economy. And so this points to a recognition that China is, to quote one scholar, big but not yet strong. and it still needs like open global economy. But at the same time, we also see perhaps paradoxically an apparent confidence that Beijing will be able to position itself well to secure its interests relative to other countries. With that, I'll pause here and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Wong. Dr. Haggard.
I'm really sorry I couldn't be here. This is a terrific panel. Unfortunately, we teach for a living, and this is the middle of the quarter. So these are really excellent papers, and so I'm just going to give some comments that hopefully will help the entire project as well, because some of what I'm going to say pertains to the papers on Japan and Korea as well. So the first point I want to make is that just struck me in reading these papers is the extent of mirroring across them. And by that, I mean on all of the components of economic security I'm going to describe, from denial strategies to industrial policy, we see all four of these countries essentially grappling to make policy innovations. But the institutions and the instruments for doing so are really quite radically different. And I think for the editors, I think this might be your job, Clint, picking up on this theme that the ultimate policy objectives are quite similar, but the institutions and instruments are different, might make for an interesting read. And of course, as you know, there's some really interesting surprises here as well, because a country like the United States, which is not known for having a sort of centralized industrial policy, is moving towards one. And a country like Korea, which hasn't thought of dependence on China as a constraint, is now thinking about those sort of security concerns. So let me start by giving you an overarching observation that hopefully will help the discussion, which is I think that the competing and different conceptions of economic security that are running through the discussion should be pulled out rather than merged. And Andrea, I think you'll see how this pertains to your paper, but it's true that different policy objectives have been combined and aligned in various ways. But I want to argue that they actually pose somewhat different policy challenges and trade-offs, and I want to emphasize those. So let me start with Andrea's paper, which I just really learned a lot from. She hooks the paper on the long history of export control regimes, and essentially is in the space that I would call the Farrell-Newman space, the weaponization of interdependence and choke point strategies. And as Troy noted in his opening remarks, which I thought was interesting, is that these denial strategies can be traced all the way back to the strategic embargo. But the important point to note is that the objective of these policies is to deny a competitor or adversary access to a technology, either because of classic security concerns, that is, that the technology might be directly weaponized, literally weaponized, but it also may be as a result of intellectual property concerns, for example, that I thought didn't get as much attention in the papers as I thought they might receive, because that's clearly a motive. Now, in terms of the instruments, I would argue that this denial motive can arise with respect to both export controls and the investment screening process. So even though we think of export controls and investment screening as somewhat different policy instruments, to the extent that they're aimed at denial, they're really going after the same kind of policy objective. And I think that's important to keep in mind, because sometimes we place a lot of emphasis on the difference between export controls and investment controls, but in effect, I see these as part of a wider denial strategy. Now, the big issue for achieving these objectives, this denial objective, is essentially the sanctions, and is like the sanctions enforcement problem. I mean, these aren't sanctions, but the denial strategy basically faces, the sanctions enforcement problem, which is how do you control leakage given the incentives in the controls for diversion and cooperation on the part of adversaries with intermediaries who will supply these goods, right? And so let me just give you an example that came to my attention, and I'm sure those of you who are more on top of these things will know this example, but it's an interesting one to me. So iFlyTech is a partly state-owned Chinese entity. And the US can pass legislation or statute which restricts the sale of NVIDIA chips to that company. But iFlyTech can rent those services through cloud computing. And so do you go after cloud computing? Do you establish rules for cloud computing to manage that diversion? And look, I'm not a sanctions nihilist. I've worked on North Korea for a good hunk of my career, and I certainly think that these kinds of restraints are valuable, in part because they raise the cost to the competitor or adversary. But there is this big problem of incentivizing what I call a parallel universe of trade, investment, and finance, which the current geostrategic environment is actually encouraging. I mean, let's be honest, folks. You know, China, Russia, North Korea, certain Middle Eastern countries are going to cooperate around undermining these export controls to the extent that they can. And you can see this by, imports coming out of Europe and going into Russia. I mean, this is just a perennial sanctions control problem that you have to acknowledge. And obviously, in any sanctions control regime, coordination with your allies is particularly important, because if there are points of leakage, then the strategy is going to fail. And we've seen these problems, as I noticed, with Central Asia and Russia. Now, the second issue here, which is distinct, has crystallized around the term supply chain resilience, which has become a kind of buzzword. But I think it's important to recall that all major firms have always had to manage risk in the design of their international production networks. For example, through diversification strategies and the nature of make-buy decisions. But what's new here is a greater focus on political risk. And I thought it was really interesting that the Japanese paper talked about the way in which Japanese policy was motivated by the 2010 Senkaku episode and the Chinese restraint on rare earth exports. I mean, it's very telling that these kinds of political risks are out there. And the type of strategies which are employed to manage this sort of risk are things like geographical diversification on the part of national firms, China plus one strategies, as they're called, but also onshoring and friendshoring, making sure that sources of supply are either onshore or with your friends. Now, what's the policy trade-off here? The policy trade-off here is, how do you define tolerable risks so that you don't undermine rules? And that seems to be a theme that came up in Andrea's paper in particular, which I liked. So she talks about formal and informal mechanisms for coordinating around these strategies, both across the Pacific and Atlantic, in ways that don't undermine rules. And I think that the fact that there was so much conflict around the IRA, which I'll come back to in my third point, suggests the importance of this kind of coordination if you're going to get a common sense or a common level set among the parties in terms of what legitimate supply chain resilience policies are and those that are in effect just protectionist. Now, the third motive, which I think receives more attention probably in Andrea's paper because of the aggressiveness with which the Chinese have pursued this strategy. But the third motive, and it's also been critical of the Biden administration, frankly, are industrial policies. And these are industrial policies which are sold on the basis of the importance of particular industries, whether they're called strategic or foundational, to national power, including military power. And China, of course, has been at the forefront of doing this in this concept of civil military fusion. They see particular industrial capabilities as core to national power and military power, and they pursue strategies to acquire those capabilities and to make them competitive and efficient. And here again, what are the trade-offs? Well, the trade-offs have to do with the rule-based order even more fundamentally, in my view, because these policies don't just involve broad parametric policies like tax breaks, for example, in the Korean case, in June's interesting paper, but also some combination of protection, local content requirements, complex rules of origin and regional agreements, and outright subsidy. And I would argue that these policies have emerged in part precisely because the overarching institutions, the WTO, have been unable to keep up with the dramatic change in Chinese practice. And I'll just focus in particular on the subsidies code, which is just clearly in need of fundamental revision. I mean, it's just not working. And so I certainly sympathize with the need to sustain the multilateral institutions, but it just seems at this juncture that they're like the Security Council. They're not fit for purpose, and they're not institutionally structured to fix themselves. And that's why we're off in a different direction. Now, let me just close with a few more things, and then I'll stop. I don't know how I'm doing in terms of time, but I think one question that the panel needs to grapple with, and we all need to grapple with, not just the panel, I try to figure this out on a daily basis, is, what is the level of integration with China that we're willing to tolerate? Because, in extremis, the idea of decoupling is just frankly absurd. I mean, the United States is not going to decouple from China. That's just not going to happen. I mean, given the extent of trade and investment across the two countries. And so the question is, what is tolerable? And I think the last section of the Viski paper spells out some of these trade-offs and might take up the question of, what kind of trade relation, investment relation do we want to have with China in the end? Is this all about just getting out? How far can that go? Now, I'm going to comment more quickly on the Wong paper. I read this paper through the lens of the policies as I've defined them here. Deep coupling to me is a way of exploiting trade advantages, for example, through the BRI. And obviously, the indigenous capabilities, dual circulation strategies are ways of managing supply chain and sanctions risks from the Chinese perspective. Because, of course, they're at the other end of denial strategies. And so they're trying to figure out counter strategies to our denial strategy, which is totally predictable. But you have to keep that in mind. In their view, they're defending themselves against our actions. And so, before closing, I wanted to draw Audrey's attention to a debate, which I'm really curious to hear her views on, which is whether Chinese economic policy making isn't actually starting to have long-run negative effects on the Chinese economy. There's been a pretty dramatic change in our view of China over the last 6 months. I mean, after the bungling of the COVID issue, which is, there's this 10-foot tall problem. China's rising, and everyone's assuming that their capabilities are immense. But I think there's been a rethink of that, because we can talk about how great it is for China to be pursuing these industrial policies, but we know that the return on capital is low, investment's extraordinarily high, consumption in the economy is low, there's growing financial distress, which is evident, and the industrial strategies they're pursuing are germane to that, because there's risk in all of the investment that's flowing into these sectors, particularly where it's not likely to yield result. And so, I think that's, just an important note, of caution to keep in the background here. But my final comment, really has to do with how we understand China at the moment. Because if you think about it, China's capabilities overall, just viewed as a scholar of international politics, have obviously expanded dramatically over the last 15 years. I mean, by any metric, China should be in a happier place than it was 15 years ago. But it's not. Its conception of its external security environment is negative. Remember, Deng Xiaoping, from Deng Xiaoping in 1978 all the way through Hu Jintao's exit speech, the Chinese line was, look, the international environment is basically okay for us to develop. And that has shifted quite dramatically. And I think Audrey's explanation for that shift is that when China was weaker, we didn't have to push back as hard. And so in a funny way, Audrey's paper is saying it's the incumbents who are creating the tension, in part because they've recognized the danger and risk, and they're now pushing back. But partly because, I'm an academic, right? And I'm a comparativist in part. But I'm looking at the political system in China changing in a quite fundamental way. And namely, the current leadership has taken a much more expansive view of security risks and has constructed, in effect, a new kind of national security state, which is going to be extremely difficult to live with. Because that new national security state not only includes an expansive conception of international political challenges that China faces, but also domestic political challenges, and particularly to the party. And I don't think it's coincidental that you're simultaneously seeing a kind of acceleration of China's attention to issues like industrial policy, at the same time that you're seeing real political regress. I mean, for example, in the relationship between the state and the private sector. I mean, it's almost as if China is in a place where it's trying to intimidate its own private sector, which has been one of the most dynamic parts of the economy. And now another reason why we should be asking whether China is shooting itself in the foot. In any case, thanks very much for inviting me. Sheena knows I'm a big fan of hers. This was a terrific panel. And I hope my comments have at least added something into the mix that you can continue the discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Haggard. You give us a lot of food for thought. I'll just defer to our two panelists and ask you maybe in turn to take up some of what Dr. Haggard has given us to respond to.
Well, thank you, Dr. Haggard, for your many thought-provoking comments, which are going to be very useful for the next draft of the paper. And I don't know in what order or how I'm going to really address, and I don't think I'm going to be able to address everything that you said, but there are a couple of things that I did want to bring up in relation to your comments. So the first regarding the ways that policy objectives have merged. It's been interesting from interacting with practitioners and policymakers to see or try to identify how the policies are being actually made and who is influencing them. And possibly there have been different ways that economic and national security have come together without necessarily being thought through by every single US agency that's involved, because different agencies are implementing different parts of the national and security policy, and they don't always talk to each other as much as all of the institutional developments that I refer to in the paper and in my remarks would seem that it makes it seem like there's a lot of communication, but there isn't necessarily a lot of communication. And what's interesting is that even for the field of export controls, where you hear different definitions being used, like strategic trade controls and export controls and strategic trade management, there isn't always a consensus in terms of the definitions there, and even less so when those tools are being expanded into new areas. And so I think that that's just something to keep in mind in thinking about the ways that different policy objectives merge or can be separated out. where they're coming from and who's actually writing and implementing the policy. I also had a thought on the way that you focused on export controls and foreign direct investment as denial strategies. And what's fascinating about the development of foreign direct investment controls is that previously there were international instruments even beyond the export control regimes that made it mandatory or obligatory for example, for all United Nations member states to implement export controls, transit controls, and transshipment controls. And that was in the context of non-state actors potentially using weapons of mass destruction. And what that led to was a number of other efforts by the US, but also around the world to implement capacity building programs to help all of those countries that didn't previously have export control programs or the other measures that were within these resolutions to implement them. But at the time, the issue of China or the threat of China, so when the resolution was passed in 2004, wasn't even really on the radar. And so issues of technology and issues of protecting technology that could be used in a weapon of mass destruction by a non-state actor just weren't considered in that resolution. So, for example, foreign direct investment screening was not on top of mind for those that negotiated those UN resolutions. However, now when the US is trying to get the support of allies and other countries on policies like emerging technology controls, it doesn't have those kinds of multilateral frameworks to really use as a justification. So it's much more difficult to go and say, well, it's important that you implement your export controls and create a foreign direct investment screening on sensitive technologies. It's much more difficult to do that if you're talking about it because it might be you might be threatened by China than it is to say that could be used by a non-state actor in a weapon of mass destruction. And so all of those capacity building efforts are facing those challenges, and that is also why it's more difficult for the US to get cooperation from other countries, because it doesn't have those underlying multilateral frameworks to work within. I also think that the point that you brought up on intermediaries is fascinating, because again, I'm trying to translate it into, well, we're talking about equipment and technology going to DPRK, for example, and how it procures them, and they use intermediaries. And, that really becomes a question also of intelligence and enforcement, and whether the US is prepared to keep filling in the gaps that it sees in terms of intermediaries that might see an opportunity and take an opportunistic stance in terms of filling in where the US does not, where the US is trying to prevent technology from getting to. And so again, that's kind of an area where the US is implementing capacity building. And there was an announcement of an ITSE fund, which was going to help measures and capacity building to implement the CHIPS Act and get cooperation from the CHIPS Act worldwide. And it's quite a lot of money, and it's yet to be seen how it's going to play out, but that's specifically in line with that area of activity. And then finally, on that point, it's interesting that, with the US legislation on trade controls, companies that I talk to all over the world fear US legislation more than they fear their own legislation. And that's because the US is very rigorous about enforcing its legislation and also penalizing companies that don't comply. And so I think on that, in that area, when we're talking about intermediaries and other countries, the use of that stick in a way, or that threat of, well, if you don't cooperate or you don't comply, we might come after you from the enforcement standpoint, could be a possible way that the US would stop intermediaries from weakening its own economic security policy and objectives. But then there's a question of how far does that go? Because that also risks alienating allies and companies as well. And I'm doing on time, but in terms of tolerable, how do you define tolerable risks and the coordination issue? I appreciate that you appreciated the reference to the different informal ad hoc mechanisms that the US has now, like the US Trade and Technology Council and others. But really, these informal mechanisms are only going to go so far, because I think it's important to coordinate policies, but again, without some kind of more multilateral, dependable, clear and transparent framework, countries are really only going to be willing to go so far, and they're not going to see an end point to this kind of policy. And I think just one more issue that I wanted to bring up was the cooperation with industry within the US and how these different policies can affect industry. So industry has to actually put a lot of money and resources and time and expertise towards compliance with US trade controls, that all of those resources drain from other areas, like potentially, research and development. And companies are, they can only handle so much because they have to comply with sanctions. They have to comply with the traditional security related export controls, and then now they have this to comply with, and it's just a lot. And so that's an important factor also to keep in mind in terms of the effect on US industry and what it's sort of willing to go along with. I think I'll end there and pass the floor.
Okay, Dr. Wong.
Sure, yeah, I wouldn't take too long. Thanks so much, Steph, for those very perceptive comments. Maybe I'll just tackle a couple. So for sort of first, your comment on, whether sort of the negative view of economic security or the growing risks, even as China is sort of gaining capabilities, is structural, whether it's actually also a function of, as you mentioned, sort of the internal changes of leadership thinking and the sort of formation of a new national security state. Maybe I have two sort of responses. One is that sort of in my paper focusing on sort of analyzing Chinese thinking, right? I think China's interpretation of events, they're often quite oblivious to their own role in foreign policy or in sort of, an escalatory dynamic. So I think there is certainly a tendency for sort of scholars or analysts to overweight the structural element and saying sort of, it's sort of the hegemon in the United States that's causing, us to try to figure out counter strategies and respond appropriately. So, but I think at the same time, I think it can be both. I don't think both explanations are mutually exclusive. I think there's certainly an element where China's gaining power. It sort of wants to acquire more dominance or be strengthen its capabilities in certain sectors, and that sort of incites a cycle response from the United States, and then that increases sort of fear and perception on Beijing's part. And I think that is certainly exacerbated by the sort of political tightening and the very status turn that we're seeing in China's approach to its own political economy domestically, as well as with the broader centralization of power under Xi Jinping, and that sort of emphasis on security and sort of the party above all. And I think that links to one of your other points, Steph, about sort of China's economic policy is having negative effects, you know, in the longer term on the Chinese economy. And I think that's certainly true. And I think this goes back to sort of the trade-offs or contradictions inherent in a lot of this, you know, these management of economic security and then the policies at hand, where, you know, if Xi Jinping is trying to pursue comprehensive national security, right, is redoubling its efforts to guarantee internal security, regime security, and fend off perceived external threats, right, this could actually undermine its longer term economic security, because you know, if you're cracking down on foreign firms, you're going to make China less attractive to investors. And so that would slow its growth and reduce its centrality in the global economy, right? Which is, you know, the centrality is a position that facilitates Beijing's ability to use its coercive power, right? So there is certainly sort of some short-term and long-term trade-offs in that. And I don't think China or you know, in many countries are grappling with these issues. And I don't think China has fully thought through how to manage these trade-offs. And I think it is hard, you know, we do often think China is 10 feet tall, but it is often shooting itself in the foot, as we've seen sort of in this rare earth and Japan case, right, where you know, I think it sparked a lot of efforts to find alternatives and sort of, you know, reduce dependence on China. And I think it is hard for China to weaponize supply chains. It hasn't, you know, done it really concretely or effectively at a large scale. I think it's fearful of other countries doing it, and if, you know, if it tries to cut off, you know, ban exports of, you know, rare earth or sort of related products, right, that's going to cause a lot of employment losses. It's going to affect China's on economy domestically, and so I think, you know, that is a major challenge for China, trying to actively weaponize supply chains. But I'll stop here.
Thank you. Let's turn right to I'll try to place to Sheena for a question.
Sure, thank you.
Could you?
Thank you for a terrific.
Can I give you the mic, Sheena? So we could get on a recording.
Thanks, Mark.
Thanks so much for a terrific discussion and terrific set of panels. I wanted to pick up on this point about the extent to which there's mirroring occurring across the different countries in the region, and particularly in the US-China relationship, because you sometimes hear this in discussions of securitization in the US-China relationship, that the two countries are mirroring each other. Both are sort of gradually securitizing the economy. But I think it's a really important point that the systems and the tools that the systems have available are fundamentally different. And so I was thinking about this because I have kind of an allergy to this idea that both the US and China are doing the same thing, because the tools are so different, even if the objective is maybe in this nebulous way, kind of the thing they're driving toward is similar. So I was trying to think about what are the differences that matter. And I think it might be interesting and helpful to draw those out, right? So the obvious one is that one of the countries of the four that we've talked about today is an authoritarian political system, and the others are democracies. Maybe that's the relevant distinction. I actually think it is in terms of mirroring on some of the more traditional political and security politics. I'm not as convinced that it's the central driver when it comes to economic security, because you also have this issue of is this a function partly of a history of a statist approach to economic management and to development, and a certain conception of the role of the state, right, which has been different in across the four countries that you're looking at. But then there's also this question of, and I'm thinking about this in the Chinese context, where I've read a couple of articles, not very many, and they don't seem to have gotten any traction, talking about the risks of over-securitization or pan-securitization, I think is the translation of the term in the article I'm thinking of. And so even when it comes to the economy, right, the ability of certain actors in the political system to push back on securitization of the economy is still a function of the political system, right? The US private sector probably has more tools available to it in terms of lobbying Congress or the executive branch than the private sector does in China to push back on economic securitization. So I think it would be interesting to try to tease out to what extent is a sort of this process that might broadly look like mirroring actually quite different when you start looking at the tools, because I think that would tell us a lot about both the current state and future trajectory of these processes. But I guess, you know, broadly speaking, I think the paper's right that Xi Jinping, I guess one final point that I wanted to ask Audrye in particular about, I think sometimes when we talk about Xi Jinping as being willing to trade economics for security, right? So there's been a spate of news articles talking about development has now taken a backseat to security. You hear this phrase, security is a precondition for development, in the party rhetoric pretty consistently now, more and more in the last few years. But is that the way Xi Jinping or Chinese scholars actually think about it? And I wanted to ask you, because you've read these sources more closely than I think anybody I know. Or is what he's actually doing making a trade across the time horizon in terms of China's economic security? In other words, I'm going to take the short-term drag on the economy now, even though, yeah, that might cause some, issues and some protests around zero COVID and whatever. But I'm going to do these things because I have to do them to accomplish long-term economic security. In other words, does he actually think he's trading economic growth or development for security? Or does he think he's taking a short-term hit on economic security that's manageable in order to protect against a long-term risk that's potentially more devastating to China? Do we have a sense of the time horizon process that's going on here? Sorry, that was a longer question or set of questions than I meant. I'll stop there.
I'll just briefly talk about your point about the authoritarian versus democracy and how that might influence economic policy. And it's interesting because, in fact, in the US, the private sector is so involved in talking to the different government agencies that are responsible for economic security policy. So even after ECRA, there was the advance notice of proposed rulemaking on the emerging technologies, and there's one on the outbound investment executive order and others. Also, the Department of Commerce, pursuant to ECRA, involves industry in these working groups on specific technologies, so that it has an idea of not only where the technology is, because they're policymakers, they are not always experts in the technology, whereas the private sector is. They know exactly what's going on and what their competitors are doing, so they can talk to the policymakers and help them make more sound policy, and involving them does that. And you see something similar also in the EU. So there's similar involvement of industry. And I know that in Japan and in Korea, there are different kinds of organizations that serve as a pathway between the public and the private sector, again, for implementation of export controls, but also the policymaking. And so the policymaking angle of it. And so I think that that's something that's really interesting and worth considering, and I'll definitely kind of focus on a little bit more, because it is a really important factor in terms of what drives U.S. Policy in this area.
Sure. Yeah, thanks, Gina. Those are really interesting. Those are really interesting questions and comments. I think I would sort of mostly take them on board as I edit the paper, but I think one, in terms of sort of the ability to push back and sort of depending on sort of the domestic political economy structure, I think that's absolutely true. And certainly in China, with sort of the history of sort of a heavy state hand in the economy, right, I think there's less overt pushback, though I think, I think even Xi Jinping faced pushback when he was trying to sort of elevate the security development sort of notion, right, where he sort of first announced sort of this new idea in 2014, and it took several years for it to actually be officially sort of adopted in the party sort of documents and statements. So I think that obviously that process has been pretty opaque, but I think there was some pushback from the State Council, and so we do see sort of some internal contestation over sort of what securitization means and sort of the balance between economic development and security. And I do see a fair amount of Chinese writings sort of talking about continuing economic integration. We need the global economy. We sort of are still learning. We need to sort of get more investment in technology, and sort of some have written of sort of continuing interdependence. So it's balanced on both sides of the US and China. So it's harder for both countries to sort of weaponize that, against each other. Of course, I think there's diversity in the writings, but I think there's certainly attention to sort of perhaps preventing, over securitization. Though there was also one article I read that talked about, we talk a lot about external threats, but we also need to think about internal sources of threat, which I actually read as perhaps an over securitization, because it's saying like, we need to respond more internally in order to sort of prevent those external threats. And that was the main source. And in terms of, your question about whether it's a time horizon trade-off, I think so far the writings haven't been super explicit about that. And partly obviously because of the political system, a lot of these writings are sort of just, echoing Xi Jinping's sort of rhetoric and the broadest level. And perhaps I think they're trying to figure out how to actually implement, these trade-offs. And I think, I think I would broadly agree with you. I think there is a notion that economic security is a long-term thing. We need to sort of, strengthen our industrial policies. We need to sort of strengthen our position in industrial supply chains. And so, even if we're implementing certain policies today, that may not generate immediate economic growth. But the idea is that sort of throwing a lot of resources right now will eventually sort of produce some winners and allow China to be in a stronger position. In the longer run. But I think the time horizon thing's interesting framing, and I think I'll go back to the sources and look into that.
Well, I see we have one question online, which I'm going to take a look at. Is anybody else in the room? Would they like to pose a question? I can gather them both. Troy?
Okay. So I think, or maybe, oh, there it goes. Okay. So I think to me, what's sort of interesting, and going to some of Steph's comments, is that I think in some ways, and I don't want to use the term mirroring, but I do think maybe the US and China are doing a lot of the same things for different reasons. And Steph, I take your point on investment screening, because if you look at a lot of what the US has said about this, it's about preventing companies from investing in technologies where they could then take the IP back to China. So, it's definitely about the denial of technology. But at the same time, and I have to go back and look at the details, Chinese companies that listed on the New York Stock Exchange had not been providing all the disclosure information they wanted. And the Chinese government did not want to let them. And we had to negotiate basically sort of like a halfway house. So you can see where China is trying to also deny access to corporate information on the Chinese side as well. So you have this going on to where neither side really trusts the other. There's this lack of trust that I think is playing into some of this. And part of that is because I also think, and one also has to be careful in how much you say something, but the potential for the technologies we're talking about now to radically change the international system, I think is playing into this, because AI is that type of technology that will either significantly change things or that will take and be underwhelming. It's also the type of thing that, where if we look at things like quantum computing would eliminate any encryption that existed now and radically change the way things are done. So not just from the perspective of, national security, but in terms of economics, whoever can get these foundational technologies to work the way at least we think they might work first has significant economic advantages. And so you're really talking about how things will play out over the next few decades, and because I think these technologies, because we don't actually understand how AI works, and this is I think the real challenge, is it's unclear if once someone gains that advantage, if it's even possible to catch up, or if it becomes basically until, at least on AI, until quantum computing is done, and basically that country has a significant permanent advantage. And so I think this is why you're seeing this play into, is that and this, I think it's to Sheena's point about authoritarianism versus democracy. If the EU were to get ahead, we might be upset, but I don't know that we would try to stop it, because we have the fundamental distrust of China, and China has a fundamental distrust of us. And we should be clear, and I've been in other conversations where people talk about the Chinese perspective, and that, when we take in place, even though we do it through our legal system, restrictions on semiconductors and things, they view that as economic coercion. It's not simply, well, this is US law, okay, we have to live with it. They view it as us coercing them. So you have this cycle going on to where the stakes are high. The stakes are potentially higher than maybe they've been in the past, at least from the perspective of the actors in play. And there's not a way to take and bridge the trust divide. And so I think this is the challenge is there, because, we've talked earlier today about, the WTO and whether it could serve as sort of like a smoothing rule. Is there an international mechanism? And maybe this is the real question I'm getting at for Andrea and Audrye, to where the US and China could come to some kind of understanding to where these are the restrictions we're willing to have on semiconductors. These are the restrictions we're willing to have on AI and algorithms and things, and how we view this internationally, not just to take and manage the competition between ourselves, but also to take and ensure that these technologies don't, as we were doing sort of in the post-Cold War era, get to third-party actors like, say, the Hamases of the world, since that's sort of on the table right now, to where they can do damage. So are we at a point even to where we can take and have that kind of conversation about how do we bridge those gaps, maybe have some restrictions we put in place, but restrictions that each side understands and respects, given what is potentially at play and the dynamics? Thank you.
Thank you, Troy. Maybe both you could quickly take that up and we could move to wrap things up.
Yeah, sure. So, yeah, okay. Again, I want to address first the FDI topic again, and then I'll try to answer the broader question. So kind of going back to FDI, and it's one of many policies that is trying to deny that access to sensitive information. But the interesting thing about US investment screening is that it's neutral. So apart from the outbound investment executive order, which is less neutral, the inbound one, in terms of companies coming in and investing in US entities, that's neutral. And so you can't really say that it's a legislation of denial, because just like export controls, actually there's a license requirement, but most of the licenses are granted and few of them are denied. And with most of the screenings that come under the threshold for having to be screened and having to file information regarding the transaction, most of those are, go through the process. And so it's more of a way for the US to be able to amend transactions that take place so that they are more safe and secure, or if necessary, to deny them. And so I think that's an important point, but that also that there's a lot of other tools that the US has been employing in this context, apart from export controls and foreign direct investment. I mean, one of them kind of comes under export controls, and that's deemed exports. So to release controlled technology to a foreign national, even within the territory of the US, you need a license to do that. But then there's also visa vetting schemes, and there's cybersecurity measures that have been taken to try to stem that acquisition of technology. And, they can be analyzed to varying degrees, but they're all part of that toolbox as well of trying to deny access to corporate information. I don't know really how to answer your second question, because I only see signs of the distrust growing between the two countries. And that's not just specifically in this arena that we're talking about of technologies, but also how it's playing in the international stage. And so whether it's different multilateral organizations, there is disagreement or obstruction, and it is not, I don't see necessarily signs of it getting better before the distrust grows, especially as we saw yesterday. There's now also these new controls and whatever ramifications that may that may lead to. So I'd like to say something really cheery about it, and I'm sure that in the long term there will be, some kind of a different state of play. But for the moment, I'm not really sure, apart from cooperating in areas that the US and China already cooperate on. I don't know. And just another kind of last point, because the WTO has come up several times, and I think it's interesting to note that, like, in the export control policy world, we almost never talk about the WTO. I mean, they're two different planets almost. And, that in terms of the comments from the previous panel, I think that they're quite interesting, because perhaps that would be a way forward, but that would take a lot of work, and focusing the discourse and focusing concentration of people that are within specific agencies that don't have the WTO in their sight or mind at all when they're thinking about these questions to do so. So that's my take.
Audrye, you want to close us out?
No, I think, yeah, well, I think Andrea covered a lot of ground, and I'm sorry to end on a pessimistic note that I don't think, given the current state of US-China relations, that sort of like these broader discussions of public goods and how to sort of prevent transfer of technology or weapons to undesirable actors is probably not on the table, and the priority is for each party to consolidate its own lead. But so I guess I'll end here.
Quick and pessimistic. That's good. We were slated to go to 3:30, so we will end within time, and I'll keep my closing remarks very brief. Just again, thanking UT Austin and the Strauss and Clements Center for your hospitality and wonderful facilities here, which have enabled this, I think, very productive 2 panels. And both of our discussants, former Trade Minister Yeo and Dr. Haggard, for your thorough reading of the papers and feedback as well. And of course, to all 4 panelists, Dr. Wong, Viski, and Pak and Suzuki, for your contributions. And as was alluded to, these papers will be revised and updated based on the feedback they've received, and will later be published in KEI's flagship journal, Korea Policy, the 3rd issue of this year, which will come out hopefully before the end of this calendar year is our current schedule. So if you are interested in that, please do consult our website. We post both digital and we do have hard copies as well upon request. So I guess one more collective thank you to everyone involved, and look forward to future collaboration with our UT Austin partners.